Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to speak here. I'll be presenting today. Dr. Jenn Thomsen is also online right now and can answer questions, but I think just for the sake of brevity, we'll try to just keep it as short and sweet and one presenter. I think this is kind of a good spot for this presentation in that, yesterday moving from DEI and understanding equity through outdoor recreation, and then moving today towards strategies, we're going to be really looking at one of the strategies for managing, especially increased demand for outdoor recreation amenities, but doing so with an eye towards equity and equitable access, looking at reservation systems, which are a big topic across the ground, both in Canada and here in the US. So today we're talking about campground camping, and I want to be pretty explicit about that because we're talking about developed campsites, so the looped campsites, front country, picnic table, fire pit, those sorts of things. We're not talking about the campsites you've probably read about. If you're familiar with the literature, we've been looking at campsites really since recreation research was a thing. David Cole, who's here in Missoula a long time, looked at campsite impacts, which we've studied a lot of how camping, especially backcountry camping, impacts the landscape. That is not what we're going to be talking about today, but this is just to say that this has received a lot of interest over the years, backcountry campsites, backcountry camping, and the campers we're talking about are different than those campers that we've studied a lot. There's been a disproportionate amount of research that's really examined wilderness campers, folks who are doing backcountry camping as opposed to front country camping, and we'll talk a little bit about that gap and why that's important. So campgrounds and the campground campers, those front country campers, the majority of campers are largely forgotten recreation resources in the research. It's really a drop in the bucket, the amount of research that's been looked at specifically on these front country campers as opposed to backcountry wilderness campers and backpackers. And that's fairly interesting because campgrounds are a really big deal. Both in the US and Canada, 67% of North American residents camp at least occasionally, based on 2021 data. And during the pandemic, we saw a huge growth in camping demand as first-time campers in the US grew by 5 times in 2020 in one single year. And camping's a big deal economically as well. According to data here in the US from the OIA, excuse me, camping generates $241 billion in economic activity compared to the US museum industry, 62 billion, just to provide a little bit of a frame of reference. And in outdoor recreation, which we often struggle with, overrepresentation of whites in terms of participation, campers are kind of a bright spot in some ways, in that we have far more representation across campers in North America and in the United States. And a lot, importantly, this, I don't have data up here to support this, but there's a lot of aspiration among lower income individuals who would like to camp if they're going to enter any outdoor recreation activity. Camping is kind of the top of their list along with hiking. Yeah, generally more representative. And camping, as you are all probably all too aware, is blowing up in demand right now. So across the border, so here in the US, in Montana, Northern Idaho, we're certainly seeing a huge demand rush in camping, partially inspired by the pandemic. And then in Canada, camping is also increasing in terms of demand, and Parks Canada and Alberta are just, in my small amount of research, just reading some news articles and preparing for this talk, that's a really, really interesting discussion online about measures to manage camping demand in Alberta. So perhaps if there's any folks who have any insight on that, throw that in the chat. Just as an example of how insane demand is for camping right now here in the US, this is a quote directly from the recreation.gov's newsletter they put out periodically. A popular campground with 57 campsites can seat close to 19,000 people all trying to reserve the same campsites for the same dates immediately after they're released for reservation. So that's essentially a 0.3% chance of getting a campsite for a popular campground during peak periods, which, as you can imagine, when you have a 0.3% chance of getting a campsite, all sorts of things matter. Being able to have, a network of friends out there all trying to get the same campsite, so you get at least one reservation, or having really fast internet speed. Here in Montana, a lot of rural areas, very slow internet speeds. And so it's going to put you at a serious disadvantage in trying to get one of these campsites through a reservation system. And as in partial response to the increased demand, we're seeing more and more national parks and national forests here in the United States move their campsites to recreation.gov, which is our online reservation system. And in Glacier National Park, for instance, this summer, there will be 2 campgrounds for the first time that will require a reservation during peak season. So 2 campgrounds just in Glacier moving to recreation.gov, requiring a reservation. And so there were some of us here at the University of Montana who, Jen, myself, Jacqueline Rushing, Peter Whitney, started getting really interested in, as we see this huge increase in demand, and we're seeing stats from rec.gov about 0.3% of folks being able to get a campsite at times. We started to be a bit concerned about this allocation tool and the exclusionary effects it might have. And so diving into the literature, we were looking at just has this proved exclusionary in the past, these reservation systems? And the best thing we could find was this really interesting technical report from 1976, which looked at this issue when reservation systems were growing in popularity, and found that just 34% of campers in California actually had the ability to plan for trips 12 weeks in advance. Now, in some national parks in the US, you can book campsites 6 months in advance. You need to have a 6-month ability to plan 6 months in advance and have your work schedule figured out, or at least have guaranteed time off 6 months in advance. That's super difficult. And so it's very competitive. And it obviously, as I mentioned earlier, when the margin of error is super low in terms of getting access to one of these camping resources, having high-speed internet, institutional knowledge, more leisure time, the ability to plan 6 months in advance, all of those things that are certainly linked to equity start to play a pretty big role. Last year, there was this excellent book, just short little shout out here to Dr. Phoebe Young at University of Colorado, wrote this excellent book tracking sort of exclusion and equity and history of campground camping in the United States. And Dr. Young really conceptualizes camping as something that just tracking its history rises out of kind of a post-Civil War leisure class in New England, and is really leisure camping is born out of this very wealthy class of white Americans. And then as it becomes more mainstream, Dr. Young documents ways in which the leisure class tried to reappropriate camping as a leisure activity that was a tool essentially for them to display their wealth conspicuously. And she also notes that early National Park Service designs in the United States were actually meant for campgrounds, were actually meant to emulate suburbs that we were seeing in a post-World War II era, to make people living in those suburbs feel very at home in these campsites. So having evocative street names, even documenting the National Park Service installing shrubbery and those sorts of things to make people feel as though they have a little plot within a cul-de-sac, reinforcing sort of the white space of the campground. And camping remains highly exclusionary in national parks. Data from Resources for the Future found that the median household income of national park campers is $4,000 higher than the US population as a whole. And there's in the United States, and I'd be curious to see if there's similar things happening in Canada, where we're actually seeing these startups that have bots that will either book campsites for you on certain platforms, or immediately notify you once a campsite is available for a subscription fee. So all of that kind of went into us crafting a few research questions in terms of how this move to online reservation systems, and online reservation systems are not new, but with the proliferation of them paired with the increasing demand, we were interested to see if those folks camping in campsites that require reservations had higher household incomes or came from home locales with higher household incomes and higher portions of white residency, as opposed to those camping in campsites not accepting reservations. So to answer those research questions, we're relying on some pretty new emerging data sets. So we're looking at using aggregated mobile phone location data provided through the vendor Near. And they have a sample, essentially a panel of 30% of US mobile phone users, and they gather your location data through apps, through ads within web browsers that you have selected to allow to access your location. And then they aggregate that data and sell it. And we're able to estimate the demographics of campers based on a common evening location. So this is where your phone or my phone spends its night most nights. So for me, it's like, here in Missoula on my bedside table, that it becomes my proxy home location, my common evening location. And we're able to surmise information about where people live and the demographics of where people live based on that common evening location. And so we looked in campgrounds across the US that had loops. So again, we're talking about the campgrounds, traditional national park design or state park design, where you have multiple loops, some loops requiring reservations, some loops available on a first come, first served basis. And we were looking at those explicitly at campsites that had really good cell service. So we had really high confidence in our mobile phone location data. And so we're just looking at those campgrounds that had 1, really good cell phone service, 2, some loops requiring reservations, some loops available on a first come, first served basis. And then we looked at the demographics of those home locales of those users explicitly, median household income based on their home census block group and the portion of white residency within their home census block group, again, all based on their common evening location. We ended up finding 5 campgrounds that met these inclusion criteria, again, like really good cell phone service, and then some loops requiring reservations, some loops on a first come, first served basis. And here you can just kind of see the breakdown of the stats, varying from pretty urban proximate to pretty rural, nationally prominent sites. Well, they're all fairly nationally prominent, but some that really are more of a tourism destination versus a weekend destination for folks like going to Prince William's Forest Park near Washington, DC for a quick weekend trip. So various demand patterns here. And then we looked across their loops to see if there were differences in income and racial distribution of their campers based on their home locations. And so, for instance, for income, we can see here, if you look at the mean difference, pretty large numbers, some of them, 3 of the 5 being statistically significantly higher incomes in those loops requiring reservations as opposed to those that are available on a first come, first served basis. So as high as $6,300 higher income on average of the home locales for Loft Mountain Campground in Shenandoah National Park in those reservation only campsites as opposed to those not requiring reservations. Some serious equity concerns here coming through. When we looked at race, we found a significant result in one of the campgrounds where almost 7% higher portion of white residency among those campsites requiring reservations as opposed to those not requiring reservations. That's the most urban proximate. So it's the one we actually had the most diversity in our campers in terms of their home locales. So big picture, I'm kind of diving into some takeaways here. These results suggest that these reservation systems can act as structural barriers to campsite use in US national parks. This really juxtaposes the idea, the very democratic nature and romanticized democratic nature of the national park idea, where we have these goods that are being provisioned publicly administered publicly by federal land management agencies that have some serious issues around exclusion. And while we're seeing this overall trend in camping becoming more diverse, and again, kind of being a bright spot in terms of participation across racial and ethnic groups, racial and economic groups across the United States, national park camping may become even more exclusive as more and more of these campsites move to reservation only, and first come, first served campsites become, in some parks, unavailable. And so this, just a couple key takeaways. Campgrounds have been, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of research that needs to happen here. I think part of it is potentially because campgrounds, they kind of fall at this interesting intersection between outdoor recreation, tourism, hospitality research. So there hasn't been a ton of research, especially recently in North America, on campground campers and understanding how those services are provisioned. And then this also sheds light on how we can use big data from a management standpoint to really understand who our campers are, who the recreationists are coming into our area, and how online reservation systems may prove exclusionary to certain groups. Again, I want to thank my co-author, Jenn Thomsen, my other co-authors, Jacqueline Rushing, Peter Whitney, for this work. Very excited that this work was recently accepted for publication as in press in the Journal of Park and Recreation Administration. Hopefully will be available very soon. And the data for this study was funded through support from NIH here in the United States. And I think we have some time for questions. That was faster than I expected. So hopefully we can have a good discussion here. I'll try to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, Brad, you have a question?
So if you work in parks, especially if you've worked in parks for a few years, you're often grabbed by people who want to complain about the reservation system, and while acknowledging the downsides of it, it's sort of like democracy. Democracy is the worst kind of government except for all the other ones. So does your research suggest any solutions that can overcome the sort of disequity there, but don't push us back into those times when we had campers lining up, on Wednesday night, sleeping in their lawn chairs to get into for a long weekend, and really sort of an unsustainable and in its own way a very unfair sort of way to allot campsites and first come first serve. So you have any insight on that?
That's a great question, Brad. I do have an answer for you. So didn't really have time to get into the theory behind kind of our approach here, but we used something that was developed by Bo Shelby at the University of Idaho, and really proliferated through his career, looking at what's distributive justice, which looks at the efficiency, the equity, the equality of various outcomes, and need is the other tenet. And we're starting to see some, because reservation systems have just become, it's starting to get noted even by the National Park Service. Some parks are noting the exclusionary nature of these. We're seeing some innovative strategies actually proposed by Shelby back in the day, where one is a lottery. So Yellowstone National Park is moving toward this for their backcountry permits. Yosemite National Park trialed this last year, and they're trying on a different campground this year. But Camp 4, a really, really popular campground in Yosemite Valley, had that exact situation you're describing, Brad, where it's people sleeping in parking lots, creating safety issues, not a good situation. So they moved to a lottery system. In North Pines Campground in Yosemite this summer, they're going to be trialing a lottery system where you have a period around now. Like, it doesn't fix the planning horizon issue and the exclusionary nature of that. I'll get to another example that does that pretty well. But you enter a lottery, and then if you are selected for the lottery, then you get to go in during a certain period of time and book your campsite. and that's moving more towards trying to level the playing field a little bit. In Camp 4, they actually have a daily lottery. So that's the day before you're hoping to camp there, you enter a lottery, and then you can move. If you win the lottery, you automatically get a reservation. If you lose the lottery, they give you examples of other campsites that still have vacancy or are likely to have vacancy on a first come first served basis in the surrounding area. So those are some of the solutions that we propose in the paper, is like, you know, really following more of the best practices of distributive justice.
Do we have any more questions for Will?
Looks like there's some in the chat here, potentially.
Oh, Elizabeth, did I just see you?
I see Anne's hand up. She's beat me to
Oh,
it.
there, I see it. Thank you. I didn't see that. Thanks. Go ahead, Anne.
Thanks. Shall I let you answer questions in the chat? There's some really good ones, and then I can wait my turn.
Yeah, Will, do you see those?
Yeah, so Steve has a good question here. If camper backgrounds are becoming more diverse, then how are reservation systems becoming more exclusionary? So campgrounds outside of these high demand national park campgrounds, campers in the US are becoming more diverse. But in these highly demanded national park campgrounds, where we have good data, the national forests don't have as quality of data as to kind of how things are moving. Things are not growing in terms of diversity or representation at the same pace that the rest of the US is.
Thanks, Will. And Mike has a question.
Oh, Anne and Elizabeth can go before me. I'll go after them.
Thanks. Yeah, this is so fascinating, Will. Thank you. Really important. I always feel like it's really challenging, right? You've done this great research, and clearly even, you know, the National Park Service is aware of this issue. So I guess I had two questions maybe. One was, it's always a challenge, I think, to really understand with whom you should be sharing the research, who has the power to make the decisions, and how to build strategies to do that more effectively. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. And also if you feel like there's another place in the world where they have some really innovative ideas that could be helpful. I know how great it is for us in the Crown Managers Partnership to have the opportunity to learn from our Canadian colleagues and partners, for example. So I'm not sure if there's some good examples that people can talk about on the call.
Yeah, I'd be really anxious to hear about examples people know about, or you know, little things that are being piloted. To your first point, I published a paper last year on campsite demand and how people select campsites using big data. And you know, we published the research article, but then a lot of it was just working with that. People are really interested in that. I think just because that was a very common experience people have, like, how do you select a campsite? Do you want to be close to the bathroom? Maybe not too close to the bathroom. And a lot of it got, like, the Missoulian here in Missoula, Montana picked it up, our local newspaper, but also like national outlets picked that story up. And then I was getting emails from Forest Service managers who were like, oh man, this is so interesting. And so I think getting it out into outside of just the scientific literature, and making sure you're working with journalists that really can best represent your science. There were certainly some outlets like Men's Journal here in the US, which very poorly represented our science. But I think trying to get it out to the broadest audience as possible.
And did you have a follow-up question to that, Anne?
No, thank you. I just, I feel like it's really interesting because we've heard from the Glacier National Park, for example, about, you know, the lottery system and how that's been set up. And I feel like we can say, like, here are the people who are making decisions about that. So then I always think, who is that for the National Park Service and the lottery system, for example? Anyway, it's a little harder to do at the national scale.
Yeah, I do want to respond to Mary's question in the chat. Aren't lotteries done online, and doesn't that have the same effect on diverse populations, connectivity issues, et cetera? The advantage with the lotteries, it's not this click, 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 click. Like, for instance, Yellowstone National Park's lottery that's going on right now is the month of March. Essentially, you can go in and enter the lottery for that month. And then based on the outcome of the lottery, your window where you can go in and book a backcountry campsite is determined. And so the high speed internet issue, the leisure time issue of being able to have time to go in there at 10 a.m. Mountain Time to book your reservation, you don't have to have that window. You could do it, in the evening, in the morning, really for an entire month, you have time to go in and make it. So that's just two, there's certainly trade-offs, but those are two ways that the lottery systems based in like the distributive justice framework are advantageous.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Anne. So Elizabeth, did you have a question as well? Or were you just helping me identify a hand?
I would just reflect on the idea. It's really, the diversity is starting to really climb, I would say, in terms of visitors to the parks here in Alberta, I would say, or especially in Edmonton here, which is much further north from you guys. But the area that I think is really intriguing though is the use of freedom camping sites and or random camping sites, and how that transition is happening. I think those are zones of greater conflict, and equity access is certainly an interesting issue too. So I just agree with Will that these are interesting questions, and just at that intersection of just getting people out into nature more and enabling that, it's a really interesting path that you're following.
Thanks. And Mike, you have a question?
Yes, I do. So Will and Jen, I'm on the Rocky Mountain District, which borders Glacier National Park, and on our district, we have 15 developed campsites. About half of them are fee sites and the other half are free. And in comparison to Glacier Park, we have no reservations. The only type of reservations we allow are for large groups. So you have to call on the phone, talk to someone in the office to do that. Otherwise, you show up and you get your use according to you showing up. And we have one site right on Highway 2 there at Summit that is open to anybody, first come, first serve. And it makes the biggest money for us because a lot of people can't get reservations in the national park, and they end up at our site. And it's usually 1 or 2 nights, one night mostly, because they're there to see the park, not the national forest. And so it'd be interesting to see about diversity equity in a comparison of Glacier Park to the front country. And we have enough campgrounds, I think, that you could do that. And so I just wanted to point that out. If you have anybody that's looking to do a senior project or a graduate study, anytime.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's an awesome idea. I mean, that's the case in so many national parks here in the US, and I'm assuming in Canada too, right? Where like what Elizabeth was mentioning about freedom camping, like dispersed camping just outside the borders of parks. Like David Cole here in Missoula has used to, studied that, where like right outside the border of the parks, looking at all the campsite impacts that are right there, but also the developed campgrounds. I mean, I do a lot of work in Grand Canyon, and they're sending people, they're always turning people around, saying, no, go to the first come, first serve Forest Service site just outside the park boundary. I think that's an awesome idea it'd be the exact same analysis, just looking at the campgrounds in Glacier versus the surrounding national forest and looking at the demographics. That could be really interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just add in too, this idea obviously can be applied to lots of different contexts. Another site that our group is working on is looking at like river reservation and permits and lottery systems, and when that has gone into place, when has that shifted, where they're seeing some observations as to, is it shifting the demographics using this place because of that? And how do we actually, use data to make assessments versus just more anecdotal, information. And so there's lots of context, and I love the idea that Mike brought up, like comparing sites, comparing different types of systems. I mean, it's a lot of, experimental, and I know Glacier and other places are trying to make these systems as adaptable as possible, seeing where, how they can, adapt even on a week-to-week basis, day-to-day basis, which I know is difficult for planning, but trying to, see what's working, what's not. And I think the hardest thing I think as a researcher is how do we talk to the people that have been displaced or no longer using these places? As we know, that can be a difficult group to reach out to, but, using other forms of data that I know, Will has looked into, and, and cell phones and all these other things like can also be another way to do this. And so that's been opened up a lot of opportunities to try and assess this.